the Sewing for Mission Circle. She is on the Congregational Care Council and has brought casseroles and meals to shut-ins and planned dinners and picnics for our congregation. We know Ellen as a retired school teacher and proud grandmother. Tonight, we will get to know Ellen, who is not yet married or even living in America. Tonight, we are privileged to hear the story of Ellen Peyton's early life and how this has influenced her and made her the Ellen Peyton we know today.
Thank you all for inviting me to come and give this talk to you about my early life in China. This is a talk about what I remember as a child. So there'll be a lot of gaps in my talk. I have forgotten a lot of things because of the ugly experiences that I have too. But I think that you'll find what I have to say interesting. In 1936, my uncle, who was a physicist in Germany, started to tell my parents that they needed to leave, that awful things were starting to happen to Jewish people in Europe. But my parents, who were German and lived in Berlin and had a good life. My dad was a grain broker in Germany, and my mother worked for a couturier shop where she bought the trimmings for the designers. So they had a really nice life, and they were German by nationality, and their faith was Judaism. So, but they didn't really believe, the news wasn't the way it is today. Today it's instant, the news trickled down. So they didn't really believe my uncle. But by 1937, they were having to wear a Star of David on their arm. And so my dad thought, well, maybe he better look into a way of getting out of Berlin. And he started to apply for visas to other countries. And many of the countries, including America, had already closed their doors to refugees. And so they heard that the Orient accepted people, and my dad got visas for Manila. And so they sent a few boxes of belongings to Manila with the intention of going there. But then it was really difficult for them to find tickets to get to Manila because there were so many people leaving all the time. And finally, my dad found some tickets with a cargo ship that had cattle in it, and they were the only passengers on the ship. And so they started off on their trip. And I'm going to go over here and point to the way my parents, the trip that my parents took. I regret that I didn't ask my parents a lot of questions. That I don't know how long it took them to get from Germany to Shanghai. They started out in Germany and went, and I remember my mother telling me that they went around the Cape of Good Hope. Wow. And then I don't know how they went. They must have been sort of this way, because here's Manila. But when they got to Manila, the captain told my parents it was not a really very good place for them to get off. And so they stayed on the ship. And then they thought maybe they would go to Singapore or Hong Kong, and either one of those, both of those places, the captain said no, those weren't good places to get off either. And they finally went up to Shanghai, which is, let's see, right here. So they made this trip all the way around. I figure that it probably took them 8 weeks, 6 or 8 weeks, because we had a friend who went from Switzerland through the Suez Canal and to Shanghai, and it took 4 weeks. So I don't know if that's 8 weeks is right, but that's in the ballpark of how long it took. And the captain and the crew made things really comfortable for my parents. I was a year old and walking around, and they were afraid that I was going to fall through those round water holes. And so they built a playpen for me. And there's some pictures, they're loose. The pictures that are loose that are on the table here are of the ship that they were on. And it shows the playpen that they built for me. Well, I'll put it up later. So when we finally got to Shanghai, there was a colony already there of Europeans, French and Russian and Germans. There were about 10 to 15,000 people already there, and they had started businesses. They had Andrew's second act, that Andy's parents had a restaurant there, and so it was a pretty cosmopolitan place. And there were two types of immigrants in Shanghai. The first group was the group that brought all of their belongings with them, and their money, and if they had a factory, they brought their equipment with them. And so they were pretty well off financially, and they had all of their belongings. And the second group was the group that my parents and I belonged to. The ones who escaped with just a few things just to get out of Germany. When we arrived, there was a Jewish organization called the Jewish Distribution Committee, and they picked up my parents and me from the ship and brought us to this place, I don't know where, that set us up in some kind of an apartment. And for about a year, things were okay, no war or anything. And my father thought he could open a business, but it failed because he didn't know how to really go about it. But just about that time was when the Japanese started coming into Shanghai. And you would see soldiers with bayonets, with rifles and bayonets in the rifles, walking around in the streets. And my mother and I had bright red hair, and they were fascinated with red hair. They hadn't ever seen red hair before. And they would come with I was in a carriage, and they would come and bend over with their rifles over their shoulders and touch my hair, and they'd touch my mother's hair, and my mother was just freaking out. She was just so scared that she couldn't do anything about it, and they really were friendly to her at that point. And they loved children. They always were really kind to children. About a year later, not quite a year later, my grandmother and grandfather escaped Germany, and they went over the Ural Mountains. They went all the way across Russia, and then all the way across this way, and then they came down in a ship. And I remember, and I was 2, and I really do remember. My mother always said, "Oh, you don't remember it, you heard it." And I really do remember picking my grandmother and grandfather up. And anyway, then my dad became responsible for 2 more people. But he was always really upbeat, and he just knew everything was going to be all right. And about that time was when the Japanese invaded the Shanghai in the ports, and they herded all of the Europeans into this compound, and then put barbed wire all the way around it. And whoever was living there was also imprisoned, because there were Chinese and there were Japanese and Indians, and so they were all prisoners too, not just the Europeans. But I failed to say something else. Somehow or other, the Chinese found out that the Japanese were going to invade Shanghai, And a big group of people, a big group of Chinese decided that they would burn the inside of their houses rather than let the Japanese occupy them. And then they fled to the fields. And so here were all of these empty shells. And so when my parents and and grandparents were herded into this place, my dad and another man somehow found materials. They found this one empty place, and they found materials to fix it up on the inside so that we each had one room. My parents, grandmother, by that time my grandfather had passed away, and my parents, grandmother, and I were lucky enough to have a room that was 9 by 12. And my dad fixed, there were no bathrooms or anything, like no running water. But my father fixed something, a partition, so that we had a keg for a toilet, and he didn't want that to be in that one room, so he built this little partition so it would be away from the rest of the room. And every morning a Chinese man would come and pick up what was in the keg, and they used that for fertilizer.
Honey bucket.
And yeah, and they call that the honey bucket. And another thing that my father did was he built some of the furniture, like the beds, for us. So, and I don't have any idea how he was able to get the materials, but he did. And he also was able to jerry-rig wire for one light bulb. And there was only electricity 1 hour a day, just 1 hour a day. And as I said, there was no running water, except that there was one pipe for hundreds of people, one water pipe for hundreds of people. So what my mother did was have the faucet open all the time with a bucket underneath it. And so that's how, drop by drop, she got water. And other kinds of water they had to buy. They bought boiling water in thermos bottles, and that's the way we washed ourselves. My mother was always we were always clean, and I don't know how she ever managed it like that, but she would put part of the water in a pan, and she would wash me. I would get washed, and then my dad would use that water, and then she would put another bowl full of water, and then it would be for my grandmother and for my mother. And so, I mean, that's how we were clean. And I only had one dress at a time, or one outfit at a time. When it was dirty and it was washed, I couldn't go anywhere. I had to wait till it was dry. And my mother would put it underneath my sheet, and so that when I slept, that the warmth of my body would smooth out her dress. My mother, and this is a toy, but it shows what my mother cooked on. And it's like a hibachi where you put the coals inside, and they didn't have any real fuel. They had pressed dirt, and believe it or not, pressed dirt after a while it does catch on fire, but my mother and my grandmother would take turns fanning this part right here to make the fire go on. And everywhere we went, we always looked on the ground so we could find either pieces of paper or pieces of wood, anything that we could use to start the fire. My mother also tried to save paper, pieces of paper throughout a whole year, so that when it was my birthday, she would make They couldn't buy presents for me, but my mother would make these little round roses out of paper, and she would attach them to our chair, and then and on some other kind of paper, she would put the number of my age. And I always look forward to that. That really meant a lot to me. And especially later when I found out how hard that she had to look for a whole year to make these roses. I want to backtrack for a minute. We were so lucky that our family lived in one room. Most of the refugees lived in these places where there would be 12 and 14 people sleeping in one room. And you've probably seen bunk beds that go from the floor to the ceiling. Well, that's how most of those people lived. And they didn't have anything but their sleeping areas. So we were really lucky that we had that one room for ourselves. One year, my mother and Dad surprised me with a game, Parcheesi. They made it, and they carved all the little pieces, and they made the board. I don't have the board anymore, but I still have all of the pieces, the Parcheesi pieces. When the Japanese came into China, there was a man named Goya, and he called himself the King of the Jews. And he decided who was going to work and who wasn't going to work, and who was going to live or die. And every month, well, before I tell you that, I wanted to say that my mother was lucky to find a job with a Japanese wool factory. And it was a horrible job, but it was a job that kept us alive. She had to frisk the workers, the Chinese workers who came out of the factory to make sure that they didn't steal wool. And if she had found anybody who had stolen some yarn, she would have had to report it. And if she would have not reported that person, both that person who stole the yarn and my mother would have been killed. And so the whole time that she was doing this, all of these Japanese soldiers were marching behind her, behind them. So, but she got paid 10 pounds of rice a week. She worked a whole week, and this is what she got paid. And I figured out we were 4 people, and so we had, this is what we ate each meal, one meal, each person. This much rice. This is cooked rice, so this is actually how much we ate. And a lot of times when I was still hungry, my father or my mother would give me the food, as most parents do things for their children. Anyway, sometimes we had, this Jewish distribution group had a food line once a day, and they served this awful stuff that it's some kind of a corn or maize mush, and I could not eat it anymore. My mother would beg me to just eat it because we would die of starvation if we didn't eat, and I just hated that, and to me that was the worst thing, and I must have eaten it because I'm alive, but I hated eating it. And then the other thing that we sometimes got was some sweet potatoes, but they were real stringy, and for a long, long time I didn't eat sweet potatoes. Now my mother never ever ate rice again, ever. I mean, she just wouldn't touch it after we came here. Anyway, my father did anything that he could find. He, at one point, he was um, uh, he delivered bread for a bakery, even though he couldn't afford to buy bread for us. But every once in a while, we did get a loaf of bread from that distribution place, and my mother would slice it so thin because she wanted to look at each piece to make sure there weren't any bugs in the pieces of food. And she did the same thing with the rice. She looked at every kernel to make sure there weren't any bugs. We didn't have refrigeration to keep anything, and there were lots of bugs. Tallahassee and Shanghai are in the same latitude. When we moved to Tallahassee, and I told my mother about the bugs here, the roaches and things, she said, "It sounds just like where we live." And a lot of people die of malnutrition because there just wasn't enough food to go around. And many people committed suicide because they just couldn't go on. It was just a really depressing place and a depressing time. But my father and my mother was always so upset about where she lived and that it was so dirty, and that she didn't have things for her child. And but my dad always, he always supported her. He always was the person who was upbeat, and he always said, when we go to not Australia, New Zealand, he was thinking that we would go to New Zealand. When we go to New Zealand, we'll have all of the things that we had before. And he'd tell her, you'll have China again, and because the things that they had brought, the few things they had brought to China with them, they sold one by one so that they would have money for food. And so almost everything that they had, that they brought, was gone. So then when we were really, really, really hungry, I mean so hungry that we couldn't think about anything except food, my mother and I would lie down on the bed, and this sounds really crazy, but we would lie down on the bed, and she would read to me from a cookbook. From a cookbook. And this is the cookbook. It looks terrible. It was in a flood in Philadelphia that I saved it. She'd read these recipes to me, and I didn't know what any of the ingredients were, but at one point she must have told me something about an apple, or apples, and I got it in my mind that I really, really wanted to have an apple. And so one day my dad came home with an apple, and the way he got it was he had a silver cigarette case that belonged to his father, and it was the one thing that he did not want to sell, and he traded that cigarette case for an apple. I'm sorry. I carried that apple around with me for a long time, and my mother kept telling me, "You have to eat it, you have to eat it." I honestly don't know that I ever ate it. I don't remember that I ate it. So that was the way my father always did things. Anyway, I did go to school. There was a school that was built by two British men way before the war, and a lot of the European children went to it. But then when the war came along, they didn't have any supplies, and they had donated books, but there weren't enough books or pencils or paper to go around. And I really have no memory of the school except when the air raid sirens came on, we had to crawl on our hands and knees into a tunnel that was dug for the kids, and we had to stay in there in that dark tunnel until the air raid sirens came on again, and that it was safe for us to come back out. The family that lived above us had a daughter, and her name was Ellen too, And Ellen and I would go to school, walk to school together, and the way to go to that school was right by the fence, the barbed wire fence where the soldiers were marching up and down. And we were warned not to sing certain songs. And of course, being a kid, I walked the line and I sang, and I sang it through the Japanese soldiers, and my mother would have fainted if she would have known that I did it, but they just waved, and they were never cruel to kids. They were just always really nice to children. But, and then the other thing that we were warned was not to eat any food that someone else would give us, nor to drink any water or anything that someone else would give us. My mother said that the only thing I could eat or drink is what she handed to me because of diphtheria and all kinds of diseases. Well, Ellen and I were walking along, and I don't know how I had so many, but I did, and I bought, well, the Chinese vendors would walk along, and this candy vendor would make these candies in bright colors out of, I don't know what, I don't know how he did it, but, and then he would stick it into this container that he had a bamboo pole on his shoulders, and then he would have a container in front and a container in back, and then he would stick the candies in there so that he could sell them. Well, we both bought one, and we got so sick we got dysentery, and we almost died. We never ever told our parents how. One of the things that the Japanese were afraid of more than anything is that people would get cholera or typhoid or smallpox, and so they were real good about inoculating everyone, even us. But that meant once a month because they never had enough of the medicine to give us a whole injection or a whole inoculation. So every month we had to go to have our shots, to get our shots. It was awful. I hated that too. There's a picture up there on the left. When you have time to look at it, it shows exactly what the place looked like where we lived. There were no trees, no flowers, no grass, and my mother or my grandmother would tell me about flowers in the forest and about trees, but I really had no idea what those things were. And I'll tell you about that. Something else about that in a few minutes. Then July 17th, 1945 was when the Americans started bombing Shanghai because the Japanese had put ammunition in centers in the middle of the people, in the middle of everyone, where everyone lived. And so they started bombing Shanghai. And I just recently read something that about the 20,000 Jewish refugees, only, 29 of them died in the bombings. But, which is, I'm surprised that it's so little. But right at that day, that 17th of July, I started getting terrible pains in my abdomen and in my back, and my mother and my grandmother walked me to this makeshift hospital, and I had an appendicitis attack, and I was operated on without an anesthetic because they had no anesthetic, and they didn't have medicine. But before I passed out, I remember seeing bombs dropping and hearing the whistle. You know how you hear that in the movies, see that in the movies, there's whistling when bombs come down? Well, that really is how they are. And that's what I remember just before I passed out. And then the next thing I knew, I was in bed with another lady. and they told my parents they had to take me home because they needed the beds for people who were wounded. And that night, a lady who was in the bed that I was in died. She had both her legs amputated. Anyway, my parents took me home and put a covered my eyes so I wouldn't see what was going on outside. And because I was a kid, again, I peeked to see what was there. And it was a terrible sight. There were bodies all over the streets and craters from the bombs, and there were big gates that were metal, that were concave from the pressure of the bombs. And my parents didn't want me to see it, but I, because I looked. So that, and when we got home, I would not come out from underneath a table. I would not. Whenever there was an air raid, I stayed under there for the longest time, and my mother brought me food under there. I just didn't want to come out. During that, just before in that summer, my mother got pregnant, and she had my sister. But my sister was born in October, so it was after the war was over. But I remember my mother standing at the door, looking up as the bombs were falling, and she was so calm. I mean, it was as if she just knew that nothing was going to happen to us. It was just a really, I just can see her now. She was leaning back like this, looking up at the sky, and very calm. My mother had brought one pair of silk stockings with her. I don't know what she was thinking that she was going to do with the silk stockings, but she wore them, and when they would have a run, she would use. This isn't the original one, but you can hardly see the hook on this. But she would take a crochet hook and bring the loop back up to the top of the nylon, and then she would use her hair to fasten it. So by the end of the war, the whole top, I wish I would have kept that, or my mother would have kept that, because it was, it would have been interesting to show, because the whole top part of the nylons were all my mother's hair. When the war was over, the way we heard it was someone yelled it over the wall. And all of a sudden, someone must have had a radio, a secret radio, and because otherwise I don't know how they heard that the war was over. But then all of a sudden, all these people started rushing out into the streets, and then and I wanted to go with them, but my mother and dad wouldn't let me. But a lot of people rushed over to where this Goya, this Japanese man, lived, and they killed him. The American soldiers, when they landed, they went around and looked at different places and found that the Japanese and the Nazis had made a pact that they were going to exterminate all the Jewish people in Shanghai. And they even had a list of the names. And they had gas chambers, and which was a real shock to everybody, because as bad as it was where we lived, we surely hoped that we had escaped what was going on in Europe. But anyway, my father got a job with the Army Air Corps, and he befriended some of the soldiers, and my mother would make soup out of I don't know what, and she would ask them to come and share dinner with us, soup with us. And this one particular soldier would wait until all of the soldiers finished eating, and then they would gather up all those little patties of butter, that they just left. And he would bring all this butter to my mother, and he would bring sugar and flour and coffee, all the things that they didn't have all these years. And his name was Bob Stanek, and I've tried to find him, but I didn't have very much luck. But in addition to the things that he brought to us, we got care packages, and they were wonderful, and K rations. You probably have heard of K rations. And I remember the first can we opened, it was a can that was like an army color, olive drab, and it had the thing to open it. You used the key to open the top. And the first thing that came out was a cookie. There were cookies and hard candies inside. But we had to eat them very slowly because we were so malnourished that anything that we ate would make us sick. One of the soldiers gave me some bubble gum and a can of root beer. And I drank some of that, and it made me really ill. I couldn't keep that down. So I never, ever, Rich can tell you, I never, ever drink. I can even be so thirsty, I won't drink pop. And other organizations like the Red Cross send blankets and clothes. We have, and the first time that we had more than one outfit to wear, and shoes. And it was several years went by before we were allowed to leave because they had a quota system of how people were sent to different countries. Most of the people went to either Israel or Australia, New Zealand, and America. And my father's quota said Czechoslovakia, even though he was born in Berlin, his mother was Czechoslovakian, and for some reason that got on his papers. And so he wanted my mother and me and my sister to leave because we had Berlin on ours, but my mother wouldn't leave him, and he didn't leave her side when she needed him, so she wasn't going to leave him. And so finally, in 1947, we were the next to the last ship leaving Shanghai, and we were on a troop transport, and there's a picture of it on that red page. It was called the General Gordon, and all the women and children were in one room, and all of the men were in another room. And it was the worst thing. It was horrible because I was seasick the whole time, and we came into a typhoon, and all of the lifeboats were wrecked. And we sort of limped into Hawaii, which was really great because we got to stay a whole week. And I saw a stand of trees, and the first set of trees I saw, and I asked my mother if that was a forest. So,
how old were you?
I was 10. I was 8 when I had that surgery, operation, and 10. And it was a Sunday that we got there, so all the stores were closed, but I didn't have any toys in China, so, and there were dolls. We walked along the stores, and there were dolls and all kinds of things. And my mother and dad felt so terrible that they couldn't, get anything for me. But anyway, they fixed the lifeboats, and then we got to San Francisco on October 31st. And we're taken to this hotel, and where a lot of other refugees were. And I met my friend Ellen again. She was still in that hotel. She had gone a couple of ships before us. And she told me, she was chewing gum, and she said, "You can get some gum over there." And I couldn't speak English, and so she told me where I could go to this drugstore down the street and get some gum. So I asked my dad if he would let me go. Well, I didn't know the name of the hotel, and I couldn't speak English. And I walked to the drugstore, and I got the gum somehow, and I walked out a different door. And I it was the most frightening thing. I couldn't talk to anybody. I didn't know where I was. And I just stood there and waited. I hoped my father would come looking for me, and he did. But it took 6 weeks for me to learn English. We went from... Well, I learned it in school. We went to Minneapolis from San Francisco. We were sent there by the organization that brought us to the United States. But my parents found jobs right away, but they couldn't find any place to live. And so we lived in this sheltering home with all these other families that couldn't find places to live. So my dad wrote to a friend of his in Philadelphia and asked about jobs and places to live, and they said, sure, come to Philadelphia. There are lots of jobs and lots of places to rent. And we lived in South Philadelphia, which was not a very nice section of town, but it was beautiful to us because it had running water, and it has lots of rooms, and it had a tree in the backyard. And so I went to school there, and I went to school in Minneapolis we lived there for about 2.5 months. And I loved it because I had never seen snow before. And this is a side thing. On the way from San Francisco to Minnesota, it was snowing. And there were lots of soldiers in the trains and in the cars. And somehow my dad mentioned that I had never seen snow before. And one of the soldiers went to the conductor, and they stopped the train. They stopped the train so I could go out and touch the stove and see what it was. It was only for about 5 or 10 minutes, but isn't that something? Can you imagine that happening today? And anyway, I went to school in Philadelphia, and I kept coming home with this story about duck and cover. We learned that if the atomic bomb would hit us, that we would have to get underneath the desk and duck under the desk and cover our heads with our clothes. Well, I told that to my mother and dad, and my mother and father were just beside themselves. Philadelphia is so close to Washington. We don't want to be so close to Washington if it's going to be hit by an atomic bomb. So my dad looked at a map of the United States, and the center was Kansas, but he didn't know anybody in Kansas, but they did know some people in Denver. So my father brought to them in Denver, and they said, come out, it's beautiful. And guess what? That's where NORAD is. They had no idea they were going into something just as bad. But that's where I went to high school, I went to college, and I met my first husband there. And I have to backtrack that my parents, this is about their religion. My parents came from very religious backgrounds, but their experiences in China and then hearing that all of their relatives had been killed in the camps sort of made them question whether there was a God, because how could a God do something like that? But I don't ever remember I don't remember going to any services. There were synagogues in China, but I don't remember ever attending it. But my grandmother did tell me stories from the Bible in German, and my favorite one was always Esther. I always had that story of Esther. And but then when we came to Denver, we started attending synagogue again, and I think that my parents made peace within themselves. And so I was married I was married at Lowry Air Force Base, but with a rabbi, and was married for 8 years, and my husband died of cancer, and we had just adopted a little girl, and so that made me question God, is there a God to do something like this for a 28-year-old nice person who never did anything to me? So, anyway, I started college. I decided that I would go to college with my daughter. She was 22 months old. And the following year, I met Rich. I was in his class, but I didn't know him. And I made a B legitimately. And I promised myself I would finish school before I would ever think about getting married. But religion has been sort of off and on in my life. But I see, when we came to Tallahassee, when Rich and I came to Tallahassee, we started coming here to this church, and it was Bruce Robertson was the minister, and our son was in a preschool here, and then when we moved to another side of town, we sort of stopped coming, and then in 1995 we came back, and it's the best thing that I think that we've ever done. And even though I question whether there was God, I always really probably, deep in my heart, I always believed that there was God. And I'm struggling here with my belief in Christianity still. But I think that coming here has made me a better person because of all of you, because of the church, and because of what you all stand for. It's what I believe in too. Anyway, do you have any questions?
Let's say thank you.
Okay, let me tell you, I'm going to tell you real quickly what these are, then after we stop, then you can come up and look. These pictures are, up here, show the soldiers taking pictures with their bayonets and, before the actual war. And then this part right here is where my dad got this job with the Army Air Corps. And then right here, there are two pictures of my mother and me on the boat, on the ship coming to China. And this picture is it's of a warship in front of Singapore that my dad took. That was in 1939. This is my inoculation. It's a record of my getting all of those shots. And this shows that I lived there in China. And these things are what my parents bought water with. They couldn't buy it with money. They had to have these like tokens. And these are my parents in 1980. And I thought I'd bring a picture of them. And these are two books that show my uncle, who was a nuclear physicist. This is a book that came out right after the war with 100 leaders of the free world, and my uncle is in here. And then this is a book of some of his inventions and papers and stuff that he
Who was his friend, Ellen?
Pardon?
Who was his chessmate?
Oh yeah, he was friends with. He was a lot older than my dad. My grandmother had 2 sets of children, and his brother was 22 years older, I think, than my dad. And he played chess with Einstein. He was friends with Einstein. When Einstein came to New Jersey, they would write their moves in letters. I'm sorry, you were going to ask me.
I was going to ask you, just for my own information, please make clear, you went from Germany to China, from China to Hawaii,
Right, the boat from Shanghai to Hawaii.
Right, and then from Hawaii to the west coast of the United States.
Right. To San
Somehow I
Francisco.
had the idea from talking to you that you'd been in South America or something.
No, my grandmother went to her son in South
Okay,
America.
So from China to Hawaii to the west coast of the
I
United States.
think we only went to Hawaii because the boats were.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So how long were you living in this compound in China?
We were in China, we were 9.5 years.
In the compound? In the compound?
Oh, well, we remained there until we left, but in the compound, 7 years.
Do you know the name of the organization that brought you from
The
China?
Jewish Family Children's Service,
Yeah, right.
but I don't know what, you know, it was a big organization all over the United States, and they sent money, but, you know, my father was the kind of person who never would let anybody, he would never owe money to anybody, and he paid back every penny of the money that it cost for us to come to the United States. He made sure that he paid that all back. He was the one who kept us all going, and not only us, but other people too. And when in Denver, there was a big organization called the Goethe Club, and a lot of those people who belonged there also lived in Shanghai with us. And I didn't remember them, but my parents did. And my dad became president of that club a lot of different times. And my father was very active in civic organizations. He belonged to, he was active in a place that for retarded children. He made sure that money was given to them. He belonged to Elks,
Kiwanis.
which is the group that has glasses for children. That is Yeah. And I mean, he was really active. He brought books to the library. He made sure that the Denver Public Library grew. He brought all kinds of books in to it. He was just really, really active. And my mother was a real quiet person, and she was a real wonderful homemaker, and my dad would drag her everywhere. I mean, he was the one who was real outgoing, and she would go wherever he would take her.
Did you have any relatives that survived in Germany?
The uncle who, oh, that's a neat story. I didn't even say anything about that. The uncle who had told my parents to leave hid all of his identifying papers in the Black Forest. And he went around from town to town helping anyone who needed help in any way. And then he would say, I don't have any papers. If I ever need to have someone vouch for who I am, would you be willing to vouch for me? Of course, if someone helps you, you're willing to vouch for that person. And so he had this fictitious name that he gave all along. And he never had his fingerprints made or a picture taken. So the Nazis never really knew what he looked like, and they were searching for him because he was a nuclear physicist and an electrical engineer. He had a whole bunch of different titles. But he lived, and my grandmother, my dad's mother, lived through the concentration camp but was paralyzed from the waist down because she never was able to walk anywhere. She couldn't do any exercises with her legs. And I never got to meet her, but she lived to 1952, I think. And then I had my uncle's daughter, and she was a concert violinist, and she, I really don't know how she survived, and her brother, but that's all. And my mother's brother and wife and child went to Holland, and they lived in they were hiding out, and their son was always crying. He just wouldn't stop crying, and so they gave him to a family that was not Jewish. And at the end of the war, they were looking for him, and that family had given them to another family, and it took 2 years for them to find him. He had polio, and that's why he was really sickly. And then they lived in Holland for a while, and then they moved to South America.
Why don't we thank Ellen again, and if you come up to see this stuff, guys, be very careful, don't touch the pictures, okay, and be very careful looking at anything. And certainly Ellen is here for you to come up to. If you have stuff on your tables, you can take it into the kitchen, we will appreciate that. And Ellen,